Welcome out the rest of the panel. We've got some fantastic people with some remarkable responsibilities. Deirdre Bishop, the Chief of the Geography Division at the U.S. Census Bureau. That sounds like a small job. Siau Yong, the Director of Geospatial Data and Chief Data Officer at the Singapore Land Authority. Jim Steiner, please, Vice President, Oracle. And last but not least, the diminutive Ivan Deloatch, Executive Director of the U.S. Federal Geographic Data Committee. So what I'd like to invite each of you to do with some of the themes we've talked about, the setting that Tim has put in place for us, all these opportunities, right? This bountiful set of opportunities that we see in front of us as a geospatial community. It's easy to, and many of us can create an entire evening of picking on things that aren't working, things that are broken, partnerships that have failed, discussions that aren't happening. That's low-hanging fruit. What I'd like to start with is some exemplars of where things are working. Mm-hmm. So if you could just each identify something, and perhaps, Siau, you could start with the center that you talked about briefly in your opening remarks. Where are some things that are working that we can look at and say, wow, that worked, how do we take it and how do we replicate that success?
I think we have probably been quite fortunate in Singapore that we are, in a sense, just a single-tier government, though there are various agencies, but we are able to come together to collaborate. Throughout my years of experience being the geospatial guy in Singapore, our first and foremost job is to see how to bring the different public agencies together, very much like the role the FGDC plays in the United States, to see how, as a whole government or as a united force, that we could make data interoperable and make data in a way available and accessible, first of all, among the public agencies for the greater good of the people that we serve. And number two is to see how we could then make this data available for the private sector, especially the businesses, to explore more opportunities to serve their end consumers. Of course, initially it's not easy in a way to bring everybody coming together. But I guess what works, which was talked about, I think, in the morning by Jack and the rest, is really about the trust. Trust among the various stakeholders in the public sector. And trust does not come easy. It takes time, in a way, to build among the relationships of the various in charge of geospatial data in the different agencies. But that brings me to a point is that how do you, in a way, build trust? And I find what work is really to work on some projects together to really showcase and realize the value of the geospatial data that could bring greater good and bring greater insights for different agencies. Because different agencies, they collect different silos of data. Mm-hmm. And the different agencies, they tend to make use of the data for their own purpose. But when this data put together and the findings put together, they could, in a way, see a greater insight that otherwise each of them would not be able to see by themselves. So we created quite a number of opportunities, and sometimes we call them synergy projects, bringing demographic data, business data, the base map data, to show how agencies could use that in a way to set location for their facilities, to prevent cannibalization, and for some social agencies to analyze where are the populations that need help. And when that, in a way, are combined with some agencies, they are analyzing crime, and when they put together, and they could see a certain pattern, and they could see that, the combined wisdoms generated from this data that all of us own could bring greater good to the entire society. So I think that's what works. But what needs more work, I would say, is the data from the business sector. I think in many occasions when I talk about data, many parties believe that the government owns a lot of data. Well, it is true that the government owns a lot of data, but I would say that it is just a tip of the iceberg. There's so much more data out there in the private sector, in the business. And it is very difficult and very challenging that we have seen to see how do you bring all this data together, especially the consumer data and the business operation data that could help, in a sense, to achieve a greater good for the entire society or the world. I think that is quite challenging. I have seen projects or maybe some ideas like creating a data marketplace. The Digital Catapult in London was trying to create a trusted entity in a way to marry the geospatial data. I mean, just imagine if Unilever's and Procter & Gamble, they could combine the data together with the government open data that we put together. I think that will bring much more application. But I have seen little success so far. Well, I think at Parsons there, we just ask if you put the Google data together with the Apple Map data, I don't know how wonderful would that be. So and I hear that Orbiter Insights is essentially pulling all the satellite data together. So that is something that I think we still need some work, but perhaps my fellow panel members would have some ideas in a way to see how we can bring that forward.
Deirdre, you mentioned some pretty astounding statistics yesterday that sounded like an exemplar of some things that are working. Perhaps you could share that. So what are those numbers, and how did you get to those new numbers, right?
I'd be happy to, Keith. Thank you. From a what works perspective at the Census Bureau, I believe that address list development and continual improvement of our geographic database currently works very well. We have our partnerships with federal, tribal, state, and local governments to thank for that. This decade, instead of starting our address list from scratch, which had been done in previous decades, we said, let's build our address list continuously. Let's work with the United States Postal Service. Doing that, we gained 5.5 million new addresses this decade using their list alone. Then we went out to tribal, state, and local governments and said, do you have address or geospatial information to share with us? And they said, yes, we do. From an address perspective, we collected 106 million of their records and compared them to our master address file at the Census Bureau. When we did that, 99.51% of the addresses matched. Now people would say, well, what's the value of doing that? From my perspective, the value was that we finally had a metric. We could say our address list is in good shape. We validate it with authoritative data sources. Using this information helped us design the 2020 census. As we prepared for 2010, we hired 150,000 people to go around and walk around every block in the nation, validating the address list and maps. This decade, because we had confidence in the quality of our address list, we said, how can we do business a little bit differently? How can we take advantage of technology? We decided to conduct an in-office address review. We hired 150 people who used 2 versions of satellite imagery, one from 2009 and one from present day. And that imagery was flowing in from NGA on a regular basis, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. They looked at that imagery and manually detected change across 11 million census blocks. This allowed us to validate 65% of the nation's addresses in the office. As a result, as we just completed our address canvassing operation in preparation for the 2020 census, we only had to send 32,000 people into the field to validate that remaining 35% of the addresses. So think about this. We went from 150,000 people out in the field to 32,000. We went from opening 151 area census offices in 2010 to only opening 39 in support of our address canvassing operation. When we looked at the numbers, address canvassing was one of the most expensive operations that we conducted in 2010. Our initial estimates right now show that we avoided over $185 million in costs by conducting in-office address canvassing. This, in our minds, is a great success. And as we look to the future, we'd like to partner more with people like yourselves to help determine how can we conduct more in-office address canvassing, and how can we move from detecting change manually, using those 150 people, to detecting change in a more automated fashion. And I know everyone in this room is very excited and has a lot of knowledge in that regard. Thank you.
Jim, do you have something to share in this regard? Or even an observation,
I'll take a different tack on this in terms of, what things are working in terms of collaboration. First of all, I'm going to shout out to Greg Scott, because I think the work that's being done to bring together the statistics community and the geospatial community is working. And I think that's been very beneficial to both parties. We're learning a lot about the kinds of things we can do, the kinds of technologies, how the analytic technologies can add value to our analysis, and how we can provide signal to statistical analysis. There's a lot of new tools and technologies that are being, both parties are being made aware of, and just a good understanding of how to take advantage of these capabilities by these two communities. So I think that's something that's working very well. I think from a technology perspective, the incorporation of spatial capabilities into graph languages and Python and some of the other technology spaces that previously hadn't really looked except at the most cursory way at how to use and work with spatial information has been working well. I think there's a lot of interest in both from that perspective. I'm not going to do customer examples of things that are working well together, because you're the experts on that and have better ones. And then I also think that in the community, there has been, across the companies that work together, I think people, the Bentleys, the Esrys, the Autodesks, Oracle, satellite companies, the Trimbles, et cetera, we're all able to take advantage and work together more seamlessly because of both de facto and de jure standards that we're implementing.
So Ivan, while I'll acknowledge a little bias in the question, Tim and I were speaking backstage about the value and the success of the National Geospatial Advisory Committee. And obviously with the passage and enactment of the GDA, it's taken on even a sort of a broader spotlight now that it actually has sort of some legislative backing. So I wonder if you could describe, to make sure that our community fully understands and appreciates the work of the NGAC, because I think it's going to be a great lever for you all in this whole strategy endeavor.
Well, thanks, Cleve. I'd be happy to. That was one of the three things I wanted to share that I think are working. The National Geospatial Advisory Committee was established in the Bush administration back in 2008, and it has been a tremendous asset for the federal government. And the committee operates under the FACA rules, but it is a committee that represents many of our stakeholder groups, the private sector, state and local governments, nonprofits. And they have been behind the scenes really helping drive some of the public policy in the geospatial arena, and been very, very useful and helpful in guiding the Geospatial Data Act. So we're looking forward to continuing to work with the NGAC in future endeavors. And there's several members and former members that are here today. So again, we see this community as a conduit to what's really happening in the real world, and it really helps inform us and kind of shapes the public policy around geospatial management and policy. The other two things that I think they're working, I wanted to share with folks, that the agencies, the federal agencies, several years ago decided to identify a set of data sets and organize them under data themes that they felt were important not only to the federal community but also to their stakeholders. And that process has worked very, very well, even though it has some challenges, and we've also identified several gaps in terms of the maturity of those data sets. But that process was recognized as a best practice by the administration, has been identified as one of those things that we're going to continue to pursue as part of the federal data strategy. And then last but not least, we've already mentioned this today, the importance of standards. And I think the FGDC has had a prominent role over the years in promoting and developing standards and working with organizations like OGC, as well as some of the other international organizations, to ensure that the standards that we believe are necessary to help not only integrate information, but also to be interoperable across the many platforms that we deal with. Thank you.
Yeah. Tim, any thoughts?
You know, just piggybacking off of Ivan's thoughts, it's really important in this audience engage with the FACA committee, the National Geospatial component that really deals with your topics, your focus of what you're trying to accomplish. And so that's the part that really makes the federal government work, because it is part of our clientele that puts that together. It's Deirdre also in these meetings with her agency from Commerce and from these other agencies from Department of Homeland Security. All of us are in this trying to work through all of these standards that might have a higher or different interest, but they all have to come together and be served up, right? They need to have these different levels so that different people who have different interests can grab what they're looking for. And again, it comes back to that authoritative data that comes out. So when the census produces its information, that it has been completely scrubbed in all these areas so that you know what you're getting a hold of is actually has the full credibility, legitimacy, and relevance of what it is that you're looking for. And those are just part of the different examples, whether it's hazards, whether it's agriculture, whether it's weather, whether it's all these different areas that people are making decisions on. Near time or near real time gets that underpinning from data sets. And that's why it's got to be so important that the federal government is right there in the middle of it, figuring out how we can serve up what it is that we're responsible for to collaborate for what you're responsible for. And again, getting back to not only partnerships, but this trust mechanism that becomes so critical.
So we talk a lot about industry and government and academia, and I think that rolls off our tongues pretty quickly. But if I look around the room, I see Rhonda, and I see Nadine, and I see Barb, and I see Anne, and Jeffrey and Jessica, who do non-proliferation work. There is a role, a critical role, for nonprofits and NGOs. And I don't know, Siau, if you in Singapore have any dealings with NGOs, perhaps even global organizations that have been helpful to you. But across the board, I'd like you, if anyone has any comments about the critical role that those organizations play, not to mention, obviously, the WGIC, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
I would say that we are just in the beginning in engaging the sectors beyond the government. For the first 10 years of our development of the National Spatial Data Infrastructure, we have been focusing in working among the government agencies within the public sector to see how geospatial data can be made interoperable and how do we build capacity within the government agencies in embedding the geospatial technology in their business processes. So 10 years, we have seen some successes, and we thought it is time for us now to channel our energy into the business sector. That is the reason why we set up GeoWorks. GeoWorks has two meanings. One is the place where we produce Geo. At the same time, Geo definitely works. So GeoWorks is envisioned to be an industry center that brings together the big partners like ESRI, Autodesk, Hexagon, Trimble, Leica Geosystems as one sort of a dominant, experienced, advanced sector, and also not ignoring the small but emerging and many of the startups and scale-ups that have dabbled into or make use of the geospatial technologies. Now, don't forget that I think Jack will agree with me that ESRI and at that time Integraph in the 90s were smaller companies, but they have grown to be giants. But similarly, we have seen a wave of smaller companies. They have, in a way, tried to integrate geospatial technologies that were invented by various giants with the other aspects of the other field of technologies such as AI, machine learning, in applying them into logistics area and into areas that geospatial has never gone before. And you know, geospatial has always been, or rather traditionally been, in agriculture, in defense, in infrastructure, but there are areas in healthcare, in real estate, in business, that have not been very well explored thus far. But we've seen quite a number of small companies coming into that area. Then we want to bring in the public sector, the government agencies, and also, quite importantly, the people sector and the NGOs. So we hope that these four sectors, they can come together at this industry center to see how to promote business growth, how to drive innovation, and most importantly, how to build communities as a whole. So we have been established 2 years. We have seen little progress here and there. What we're quite happy is that we see a convergence of smaller companies that we have previously unheard of coming into this part of Asia, such as the AirMap in United States. We have Lota Data, and from the Europe side, we have Volocopter. And from Japan, we have the Synspective that deals with the nano and microsatellite, and from Australia, from India. Now, these companies, you probably have never heard of them before in a geospatial arena, but they are emerging. They are coming into Asia to see what are the opportunities that, in a way, could bring good to that part of the world. On the NGO side, I think they play a very important role. You know, since many years ago, we have seen map enthusiast group trying to improve the accuracy of map through crowdsourcing and community building. But we have seen quite a number of non-governmental organizations. They started to get interest into making use of geospatial in driving the cause. For example, there's the little group in Singapore that's called Foodscape. They were trying to make use of geospatial technology to see how do they map out where are the so-called the leftover food. Rather, you know, you've seen that the bakery shops, they have unsold bread at the end of the day, and they would like to distribute them to those needy. But they want to find the best way, the best algorithm, the most efficient way in distributing the food that they would like to give them away. So, and we see some environmental group using geospatial, you know, to champion their cause. So we see more and more of these groups coming, and I think it is the role also of GeoWorks to help this group and to connect them with the smaller companies, to connect them with the bigger partners with good technology, so that I think the word I like to use is to embed Geo into different processes, social processes, governmental processes, as well as business processes.
Other thoughts, Deirdre?
Sure. I can speak from a statistical perspective. NGOs are some of our most important users when it comes to uses of statistical data and census data, and they have an important role to play in communicating the importance of the census and why people should respond. Our Census Day is April 1st, and for the first time, we're going to be encouraging most people to respond to the internet, using the internet. It's hard to believe that this will be the first census in which we're using the internet to promote self-response. If people can't respond using the internet, we'll give them the option to respond on the telephone or on paper. Right now, we are estimating that about 60.5% of the housing units in the United States will self-respond. But for the remainder, we're going to have to go out and knock on their doors. And this is the costliest part of the census. And so this is a risk for us. We're trying to get as many people to self-respond as possible. And the NGOs can really help there. We've already established over 172,000 partnerships with NGOs. And I know that a lot of people here, while we work for government, while we work for private industry, many of us very likely have leadership roles in positions that can affect the NGOs or volunteer. So please, when you're out there, spread the importance, communicate the message of the census, and ask those people to do the same.
Yeah, it's great.
Jim, participation, right, is a hard cost, right? When you're here, when you're at a WGIC meeting, when you're sending people out to other for OGC, right, the government doesn't always do a good job of being able to account for its investment and things like that, but there's no question in your mind how much that costs. What's the ROI, right?
That's that's an interesting question, because I don't think I've ever thought of it in terms of ROI, from a financial perspective. But the value of participating in these activities is we need to both understand what are the critical issues that our customers, partners, the world is facing, how we can address them, help people understand the capabilities that we have that may be applicable, and learn about the things that are coming next. I think that being able to collaborate is probably the key benefit of these kinds of activities, whether it's participation in the UN fora, or WGIC, or Sanjay's events, or any of these other kinds of things. It gives us an opportunity to both share what we know and learn. And I think that's really the ROI we get.
Tim, did you have a thought on the NGO question? Or?
Maybe some questions out there before our time is up.
I keep looking at those empty microphones longingly, but it hasn't worked.
Yeah. I'll take, with NGOs for sure at the Department of Interior, a big part of the work that we do is with NGOs. Our environmental impact statements, our review on biological assessments, all of those are a huge amount of public interaction on lands that are, 1 in 5 acres or 1 in 5 hectares in the United States is federal lands. And so we need that input, we need that relationship with non-governmental organizations that are giving us insights and input that are really critical to all the areas of whether it's a national park, whether it's all the hydropower systems or species or the environment, the climate, all of those get input that comes back and forth in those relationships that we have with not only state, local, tribal, but those NGOs that are engaged with us in partnerships.
Thanks. So either you've been stunned by the brilliance of the panelists, debilitated by your need to get to lunch or something, but you've been a wonderful audience. We appreciate it. I want to thank the panelists for their time and for 4 in the morning. Siau, you did a fantastic job.
Yeah, for sure.